This is Of Men and Dragons, Chapter 5, by DrBlackJack21. Look at the little orphan girl hopping from one man to the next, just like always. What did this human offer you? Warmth? Wealth? Steel? Ba'arthon was staring down at Shahar, the condescension plain in his eyes. His lips curled as he stared with lust at her thigh. He reached out for her. Why don't you come home? You can be my little pet again. I'll forgive your transgressions. You'll only have to kneel and beg for mercy for a few days at most. Shahar had heard more than enough. Whatever desperation had led her to seek out this deficient male in the past was gone, and in its place was a wave of anger that demanded Shahar take action. She launched herself forward, wrapping her fingers around his neck. She then lifted him off the ground, her rage feeding her muscle strength beyond her usual limits. Despite his current situation, Ba'arthon still leered down at Shahar with contempt. What? Does the little orphan girl have something she wants to say? Please, we both know you don't have the guts to do anything about it. Now be a good girl and put me down. Then get on your knees and beg. As Shahar's rage grew, she cried out. Her fingers started to tighten their grip around Ba'arthon's throat. His contempt still plain to see, Ba'arthon spoke one last time, though what he said felt like ice water shooting down Shahar's back. Angela, stop! She doesn't know what she's doing! Shahar blinked, and what she saw made every muscle freeze. The man she was holding by the neck wasn't Ba'arthon. Instead, Jack was dangling from her grip, one of his arms wrapped around Shahar's forearm as he tried to lift himself to take some of the stress off his neck. Meanwhile, his other arm was waving behind his back at the odd device hanging from the ceiling. The device was long and hollow, hanging from a forked piece of metal. It was waving around as if trying to point at Shahar behind Jack's arm. Shahar could hear Angela's voice coming from the air. I don't have to kill her. I can simply shoot her arm off. We're in the medbay, and I can probably reattach it after. Shahar dropped Jack and leaped back before kneeling with her head to the ground. Sitting in such a position went against everything Shahar was and stood for, but even she could tell she'd gone too far this time. The problem was, she didn't understand what was going on. Her head still felt clouded, and her thinking sluggish, but she did know that what she had done was inexcusable. Jack would be in his right mind to demand retribution. Forgive me. I'm not sure what happened. She was still trembling from shame and rage at the vision, but she forced her eyes down, attempting to convey remorse. When Shahar risked a glance up, Jack was still seated on the floor, with one hand rubbing his raw neck and the other waving her off. Don't worry about it. There's no permanent damage done, I think. And it wasn't your fault anyway. We knew the drugs we used to sedate you for the procedure weren't dangerous for you. We just underestimated the side effects. Although, if we ever need to do something similar in the future, I think I'll let Angela be the one to wake you up after we're done. Jack raised an eyebrow. The real question is, did it work? Can you understand me now? The memories came back to Shahar in a rush. After Angela had finished analyzing the results of the first set of procedures, she had announced that, with a few small modifications, she should be able to give Shahar an implant that would allow her to understand Jack. They showed Shahar a pane of glass that projected moving pictures of where Jack had a similar implant. After Angela uploaded an update to the device, he seemed to understand Shahar. When they explained the process, Shahar was somewhat discomforted by the idea of them cutting her head open to put something inside. Still, after carefully examining the back of Jack's head, there didn't seem to be any issues. At least nothing beyond his odd head ridges, but Angela explained that his hair was normal and healthy for humans. The last thing Shahar remembered was lying back on a strangely comfortable chair. Then Angela had said, You might feel a slight pinch. And the next thing she remembered was seeing Ba'arthon's ugly face. Shahar shook her head to clear the haze. I understand what you are saying, although you have an odd accent. Not one I've ever heard before. Picking herself up off the ground, Shahar walked over to Jack and offered him a hand up. Jack gratefully accepted, and as she hauled him to his feet, Shahar couldn't help but notice once again how small Jack was. If anything, it only made her feel more ashamed, as if she had attacked some helpless child. She bowed her head again. "Still, I'm sorry. It was like a dream, but you weren't you. Instead, you were someone from my past." Shahar felt as though her explanation was severely lacking, but didn't want to talk about it either. Angela reappeared. She was now wearing a long white coat with the same wireframes around her eyes as before. She leaned in close to Shahar, peering at her intently as if looking for anything else amiss. "What you experienced is a side effect called vivid dreaming. I understand it can be quite unsettling and even quite frightening. Still, your eyes aren't dilated and your stress reaction seems to be fading." As she straightened, the AI's coat seemed to dissolve, leaving her in her usual jeans and t-shirt. Angela sighed, looking down at the virtual ground at her feet, despite floating several feet above the actual floor. "If anyone is at fault, it's me. I only worried about the physical damage the drugs we used might cause. I failed to take into account the possible severity of the side effects you might experience." Jack looked back and forth between the two women with an exasperated expression. "Listen, you two can deliberate which of us is most to blame if you want, but let's do it while we eat dinner. Angela, I'm assuming that you were also able to identify what is and isn't safe for Shahar to eat?" Angela visibly brightened, nodding emphatically. "Yes, Agun physiology can handle most similar foods to human, though their diet leans a bit more towards carnivore than omnivore. I'd recommend at least 50% to 75% of their meal be meat cooked a little rarer than most humans would prefer. Also, they cannot taste sweet." Jack thought for a moment before going with the obvious solution. "Well then, how about some steak served with sautéed onions and mushrooms? Shahar can have hers with an additional side of steak, and I'll have a baked potato. Shame about the sweet thing, though. I have some great desserts you'll never get to enjoy." Shahar wondered quietly to herself what new strange thing this dessert was, and how she could be jealous of a thing that she had no concept of. Jack couldn't remember the last time he'd felt like this. Years had passed, one day blending into the next day, 1 year into the following year. He ate, worked, slept, and did it again the next day. This had gone on so long, Jack actually had to stop and do the math to figure out his current age. The number was higher than he'd realized. These last few days had been different, though. It might be the fact his survival was at stake. Perhaps it's because he's working with his hands again, or maybe it was his new house guest. But, for the first time in a long time, Jack felt awake. Here he was, cooking for another person for the first time in longer than he could remember. Every moment of his life since he'd met her seemed to hold new surprises, challenges, and puzzles. Jack stole a glance at his new friend. She wasn't what he would typically call beautiful, but it was hard to take his eyes off her nonetheless. It was like watching a venomous snake. Her movements were deceptively slow and precise. However, he couldn't help but rub his neck, remembering the explosive speed and power she was capable of. Watching her move with what was now obviously restrained power was oddly captivating. Perhaps sensing his attention, Shahar looked over at Jack and noticed his hand resting on his neck. Immediately, she visibly tensed and did something Jack associated with a cringe. Well, now Jack felt guilty for making her feel worse. Time to take her mind off of recent troubles and focus it elsewhere. Jack decided to test out their new ability to communicate and cleared his throat. "Shahar, tell us a little bit about the area around here, and more importantly, the people. How big is the city you live in? How far away is the next city over? Do we have to worry about anyone poking their noses into our business around here?" Shahar tilted her head to the side and thought before answering. "I'm not sure how many people live where I come from. To be honest, I've never really been in a position where it really mattered. Several hundred, I guess. The next town over is about a 3-day journey over the hills to the west. A third can be found 4 days to the east. I don't think you'll have to worry about any townsfolk sticking their noses into your business, but some of the hill tribes might. They are too unpredictable." Shahar stopped mid-thought, tapping a claw against her lips as she thought. "I had always thought the hill tribes so primitive and brutish, but now I can't help but feel closer to them when I compare myself to a people that can create another living being. To you, we must look like the hill tribes did to us." Jack waved her concern away with the spoon he was stirring the mushrooms and onions with. As a people, the only advantage we have is the fact we've been around a lot longer than your own. We only got this far by standing on the shoulders of our fathers. The difference between us is we have more sets of shoulders to stand on. Take away all my technology and drop me in the middle of the world like this one, and I'd be living more primitively than yourself. I'd be lucky to be able to get a fire going at all. We just had the good luck to be born a few million years before you. There's nothing inherently superior or inferior about the luck of one's birth. Jack spooned some of the juices from the grilling steak over the pan, sautéing the onions and mushrooms. Shahar's eyes narrowed, and Jack could see the muscles in her jaw and shoulder tighten. "Barthon would argue otherwise. It's by right of his family ties that he would rule the town, and I was left as a virgin sacrifice, though he knows full well I'm nothing of the sort." The last part was said so quietly, Jack wasn't sure he was meant to hear it. He grew red in the face and felt the stammer returning, as he couldn't help but envision such activities. Well, that shouldn't matter anyway." When Shahar looked at him quizzically, Jack clarified. "Well, I suppose I can't speak for everyone, but I don't see the big deal in someone being a virgin." Feeling himself digging a grave now that he'd broached the subject and not knowing how to stop, he pushed on. The only people who seem to worry about such things are the kinds of people more worried about whether they measure up to the competition than they are concerned about enjoying the time they have with their partners. Honestly, it just seems kind of petty, at least to me. Apparently, Angela had sat back listening long enough and felt compelled to throw her 2 cents in. She floated over to Jack with a look somewhere between adulation and condescension. "Grant us more wisdom gained from your many exploits and experiences, O learned one." Happy to have a distraction, Jack swished his spoon through Angela's digital body as though striking her with a sword. "I've had my share of experiences. Thank you very much." Angela swung her hand at Jack, and at the same moment, a robotic arm swung down with another spoon it had acquired. Jack brought his own spoon up just in time to fend off the blow. Angela chuckled. One-night stands with other introverts looking to scratch an itch before they went back out into the cold black hardly makes you an expert. Jack tried to stab at the heart of the arm, only to be fended off at the last moment. "I'll have you know Ashlyn was a fine woman. She just understood that neither of us wanted anything more than a bit of stress relief at the time." Angela's arm struck back before Jack could get his guard back in place, landing a killing blow. "I'm just saying, you hardly have the experience to be preaching from your soapbox. You're no Don Juan." Jack died with exaggerated flourish, falling back against the counter behind him. Cracking his eyes open, he responded, "Fair enough. I suppose I deserve that. Now, how about we serve the food before it gets overcooked?" Jack drizzled butter from the onions and mushrooms over the steaks and potato, then walked the dishes to the table to serve. Shahar watched the 2 siblings fight their duel, but couldn't help but find herself amused. They only seemed to get even odder now that she could understand what they were saying to each other. Jack set 2 plates of steak in front of Shahar, with some odd-looking plants on the side. The utensils he handed her were a little small and shaped odd, but easy enough to figure out by watching Jack use his own. The meat tasted much better this time. Every bite shot out juices flavored with meat and some odd spices. Shahar's first steak was gone before she realized it. Jack was sitting at the other end of the table with that perpetual look of amusement he often wore, though once he noticed her looking at him, he suddenly seemed to find his own steak far more fascinating. Eventually, the awkward silence seemed to be getting to him, so he looked up and spoke. Shahar was already digging into the second steak at the time, which seemed to relax him as he grinned. Well, I guess this time I got it right. You look like someone who hasn't eaten in far too long. What about the mushrooms and onions? Give them a try and tell me what you think. Shahar speared a mushroom on her fork and looked closely at it for a moment before putting it in her mouth. The texture was odd, a bit spongy, but not bad. However, as soon as Shahar really bit into it, the mushroom exploded into the flavor. It tasted just a bit like the steak, but it had other more complex flavors that were only hinted at in the meat. The spices were much more potent, giving it a more savory taste. Next, Shahar tried an onion. This time she didn't hesitate. The onion was crisper and had a strong, bitter flavor. It might have been unpleasant, but it worked well with the other flavors mixed in. It made the rest of the meal taste even better by adding a different texture and character to the mix. Shahar's mouth was still salivating at the thought of the next bite, even though she'd nearly eaten her fill. This is some of the best food I've ever had. You could make a real living as a respected cook in any noble's house with food like this. Jack's smile grew broader and more genuine. I'm glad you liked it. To be fair, this might be one of the best meals I know how to make, so I'm afraid the rest might not quite live up to such high praise. Jack's expression softened a little. I might not have time to cook like this for a little while anyway. Tomorrow, we need to get to work, so let's enjoy the rest of the evening. Tell me, do your people perform for entertainment? Do they put on plays? Shahar stopped with a bite halfway to her mouth, her hand lowering slightly at the thought. We do, but I've never really been interested. The fights are laughably bad. It's always apparent none of the actors know how to hold a sword. And don't even get me started on my thoughts about a romantic play. Jack had an odd look in his eye as he replied, I can understand that, but I'd like to show you a human version of a play. We call them movies, and I think I have a great idea of which one to show you first. Let me tell you about an old classic called Willow.